Good evening, afternoon, evening. I'm so glad that at least some of you were able to join us. There's actually more people signed up for this lecture than have appeared. Maybe they're too entranced by the beautiful weather that we're experiencing right now, as always in Santa Barbara. My name's Ike Kong. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Curator here at the museum. And I'm just delighted to be back because I took a little vacation. I was away for a whole month. So trying to recover from various things, including the Van Gogh exhibition. And I was just describing to my speaker how harmonious and peaceful the museum now seems because we were so deluged for a little while there with the Van Gogh extravaganza. I have to admit that I kind of like the peace and quiet again. But this is a series of lectures that I organize, and it's a good excuse to bring lots of different people here to speak to you. And in this case, I'm so delighted that we have someone with us who I sort of stumbled across by accident in a way. When I was writing the labels for our newly installed Ludington Court, there's a gigantic painting by Charles Christian Nahl, N-A-H-L. It's a very idealized depiction of a sunny day in Monterrey, Mexico, outside of a bullfighting arena. So if you ever are in Ludington Court, you should stare at it long and hard because it's very confused and confusing. And when I was researching the iconography and trying to identify the figures, and there was one figure that had been mistaken always as being a representation of Murrieta. And Murrieta was sort of this bandito figure who was the legendary, now historical, but legendary figure whose life was the basis for the fictionalized character of Zorro. And so when I started reading up on the representation of class and also ethnic identity during this period of time, it became clear that this was a very idealized, sort of cleansed of any kind of racial tension version of how life was in Monterrey, Mexico. And I stumbled across an article that our speaker had written that was really helpful in trying to set up this whole critical paradigm of Murrieta and what he represented. But then I discovered that he's working on all sorts of really interesting things, and so I decided to invite him to come and speak to us. And this is really not my area whatsoever. As you know, I'm not the contemporary art curator. James Glisson is, and James unfortunately wasn't able to be here, but he knows about the topicality of the olfactory in contemporary art, and so was very delighted that Professor Shu could join us. So I'm just going to read his bio, which he kindly provided to me, so sorry if it sounds familiar to you. But Hsuan Shu is a professor of English at UC Davis, where he teaches and writes about American literature, race studies, sensory studies, and the environmental humanities. His recent research is concerned with the invisible effects of atmosphere and how senses like smell and thermoception, or the sense of temperature, can make the air perceptible. His most recent book, The Smell of Risk, Environmental Disparities and Olfactory Aesthetics, was published by NYU Press in 2020. And he's currently writing a book about the cultural history of air conditioning, including in art museums, which sounds like a really fascinating topic as well, so we'll have to have you come back to give a lecture on that in the near future. So with that, can you join me in welcoming him to the stage?
So thanks, Ike, for that kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank Ike Kong and Catherine Barth for inviting me here and for all of the work that Catherine especially has put into the logistics of bringing me out here. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that we are gathering on the unceded territory of the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of this land, as well as the adjoining waters and air. So now to start. The man who pulls his perfumed handkerchief from his pocket treats all around to it, whether they like it or not, and compels them, if they want to breathe at all, to be parties to the enjoyment. This quote from Immanuel Kant's really influential Critique of Judgment captures two of the main reasons why smell was really marginalized from the history of Western aesthetic thinking as a sense that kind of qualifies for meaningful art. Smell refuses and calls into question Kant's Enlightenment values, which are also values that are really central to liberalism, of autonomy, so giving the law to oneself, and disinterestedness, right? So being able to stand apart from the thing that you're judging. Here are some other characteristics of smell, all of which I think have been seen as reasons for smell to not be useful for aesthetics. But one of the things that made me really interested in smell is that these are all like really fascinating qualities, right? And they have, I think, a lot to tell us about the world that we're living in, especially as things like air pollution, climate change, and just like the kind of production of very different kinds of atmospheres that people have to live and work and play in, that just kind of like making sense of all of that. So smell is embodied, it's immersive, it's ephemeral, right, which makes olfactory art actually kind of difficult to collect and archive. It's involuntary, the opposite of autonomy, right? It's tied to affect and emotion rather, or not as directly to reason. It's subjective and culturally variable, difficult to describe in at least European languages in words. Biochemical, not quite directly conscious, right? So we become habituated to it and just kind of stop noticing it. And it's transcorporeal, a term that I'll come back to. And I'd also say that a lot of these terms you could kind of oppose with the qualities of vision, right? So the way that like conceptions of Western art tend to really center vision as the most important sense and the most important way of relating to what you're seeing. This is just a kind of bigger context for my work, which is just that it's part of a broader shift to smell studies, right? Across a variety of fields, race studies with the smell of slavery, history, philosophy, and even kind of like art, well, aesthetics, right, with Larry Sharner's book there. And these are all great books that have come out in the last 2 or 3 years, so it's really been kind of a recent phenomenon. So before turning to the art, I want to just talk a little bit about the term deodorization, which I think of following some of these other scholars in 2 ways. So first, a historical process where most smells have been removed from some public spaces, but of course not all spaces, through nuisance laws, deodorization campaigns, infrastructural improvements, and climate control, things like this. There tends to be a kind of like history of modernization that's like, teleological, like in a sense that spaces became more and more deodorized over time, right? And that's something that I kind of push back against because really bad smells have been just kind of moved around to less powerful and less privileged communities. Secondly, our sensorium has been deodorized, right? So the sense of smell has been discredited as a rich and diverse mode of experience and knowledge. And the White Cube Art Museum, where we kind of, learn a lot about what it means to be human, what meaningful kinds of experience, aesthetic experience might entail, has been really instrumental for both these kinds of deodorization, right? So we learn to relate to art objects kind of outside of us and from a distance in a lot of museum settings. And right, so I'm just going to move on to just kind of conceiving of deodorization as forgetting on a couple of different levels. So deodorization has meant forgetting the things that smell is good for, so what it can do, forgetting the kinds of knowledge and relationship that smell enables, and forgetting really important truths about the body, right? So for example, that it's permeable, that it's biochemical, filled with affective experience and involuntary kinds of responses. that smell realizes, right? Even kind of like microbiotic relationships, right? The fact that we have a nasal microbiome, or that that body odor is produced by bacteria that inhabit, different people's different kind of like crowds of bacteria in our bodies. That's another truth about the body that I think, many of us don't think about that often, right? So just a working of definition of olfactory art, which I'm drawing from Larry Shiner's book. He writes, works of olfactory or scent art involve an intention to use actual odors in a distinctive making way that typically gives the resulting artwork its effect in a recognized visual art setting. Right, so partly he's emphasizing real odors, like the materiality of odor. And then the other thing I'd point out here is that smell is still circulating for him in a visual art setting. And so the relationship between smell and vision in these artworks, right, which they tend to get called multimodal, right? So they're not just works of smell, they're also works of visual art, sometimes sound, et cetera. That those relationships between senses are really important as well. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have experienced a work of olfactory art in a museum or a gallery? Okay, so very few, and I think that's telling. I've actually only experienced one, and I've encountered a lot of olfactory art by visiting artist studios, right? Or I'll like have coffee with an artist and they'll bring some like samples. And I've seen their work and read about it, so I kind of put things together, but you have to be in the right place at the right time, right, to see one of these things. And they're not commonly displayed in American museums, especially. Okay, but olfactory art has been kind of like really taking off lately, so I don't know if any of you have encountered it, but there's a great center called the Institute for Art and Olfaction in Los Angeles that kind of trains artists in perfuming skills and puts them in touch with perfumers to kind of do collaborative projects. And there have just been a lot more like olfactory artworks and exhibits displayed in the last even decade than throughout the 20th century. And I'll be talking about some of those prominent works soon. So the kind of quick tour of olfactory art, recent olfactory art that I'll be presenting, I've organized in terms of 3 affordances. An affordance just means a kind of design feature, or the things that a design feature allows you to do, right? So what can olfactory art help us to do or help us to think about that other kinds of art can't? So the first one is embodied environmental knowledge, especially knowledge about environmental risk. The second one I'll be talking about representing olfactory modes of racism and colonialism. And then thirdly, materially redressing olfactory racism and colonialism. So clearly a kind of continuation of part 2. The first topic is about environmental risk, which is notoriously difficult to communicate or to represent adequately, right? And this is because its effects are uncertain, highly disputed, very easy to kind of mystify for corporations, right? And also the effects are distributed across space and time, right? So moved, as I mentioned earlier, to more vulnerable communities, or these kinds of biochemical accumulative effects that might happen like across generations, right? So they don't show up right away. The critic Rob Nixon has described environmental risk in terms of slow violence, he calls it, as opposed to the kinds of spectacular violence that we are accustomed to seeing in the media. And smell, I think, is like a tool that can really powerfully represent or even directly present, right? It's not just representing because you take it in, environmental risk and the kind of idea of toxicity in ways that provoke new kinds of embodied responses. So one more term, transcorporeality, which I said I'd come back to, introduced by the material feminist philosopher Stacey Alimo. Her book is pictured there. And she uses it to name the material interconnections of human corporeality with the more than human world. And this might seem like a kind of obvious phenomenon, but she's really counterposing it to the ways that we get trained to think about nature, right, as something that's out there that needs to be preserved or kept pure of human kinds of contact or human effects. For her, there's always these kinds of interconnections and material exchanges, right, of molecules between the more than human world and human bodies, and it's more a matter of what you do with those, right, or how those are configured. And smell, I think, because smell is inherently transcorporeal, it's a tough word to say, you can't smell without breathing and inhaling, right? I think it really gets at this model of relationship between people and non-people. Okay, so the first example here is by the French artist Boris Raux, called The Swimming Pool. And it's just this kind of luminous pool of, it turns out, of fabric softener in the floor of the gallery, right? And it looks kind of visually stunning, so he imagines that one might approach it, and then he says, you feel, quote, an invisible presence, just a smell, at first reassuring, but it quickly brings on a headache, right? And I have the image of Narcissus looking at his own image there because I think it's clearly invoking that, right? This idea that, you might want to gaze into this beautiful pool to see yourself, and thinking he's also really interested in cosmetics, so fabric softener and cosmetics as these kinds of like rituals of narcissistic self-care, right? But then he's emphasizing the chemical relationships that happen, as a side effect of our dependence on these kinds of substances. So like one thing that I think is interesting here is rethinking the Narcissus myth, not only in terms of the flower's visual beauty, but also it was really well known for being like an incredibly fragrant flower, right? So like turning our attention to the question of what Narcissus and our ideas of self might smell like. This work by Peter De Cupere, who's a Belgian artist and one of the best known or most widely known olfactory artists who has really kind of like been a spokesperson for the form. It's called The Smell of a Stranger, and it was installed, it was his contribution to the Havana Biennale in 2015. And it uses smell to frame relations between the United States and Cuba. So he's reflecting on the Obama era thaw in U.S.-Cuba relations. And what he did was he genetically modified 9 local Cuban flowers and plants to emit the sense of, and these are his words, American New Dollars, blood, sperm, vagina, dead body, gunpowder, sweat, or the smell of fear, air pollution, and geraniums. So as with the smell of Boris Raux' fabric softener pool, smelling air pollution or gunpowder emanating from a flower could potentially induce a reaction in the viewer. The jarring odor has direct effects on the breather's body. There's a striking contrast also between the disconcerting smells and the visual beauty of the plants, and the kind of incongruous pairing of beautiful local plants with smells associated with sex tourism, labor exploitation, military violence, and pollution really suggests that the opening of US-Cuba trade and diplomacy under the Obama administration could have a range of harmful effects on Cuba's people, its culture, and its environment. So the third example I've chosen is by the LA-based artist Hsuan Raspit, called Micro-Encapsulated Surface Coating, which is a great name for a work of art. And I'm not going to read this whole description of his process, but the key parts of it are that he analyzed or had analyzed the molecular composition of the air of the Jessica Silverman Gallery, which is where it was exhibited. He amplified that chemical signature by several thousand-fold and then sprayed it onto all the surfaces as a scratch and sniff emulsion. So viewers could scratch and smell the ambient kind of air of the gallery. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with this. I don't think it's serious, but yeah. So basically, instead of exhibiting in the gallery, he's exhibiting the atmosphere of the gallery itself, right, as something that's really carefully curated to preserve works of art and to kind of preserve this sort of like distanced relationship between the body, right, which doesn't have to think about itself if it's not smelling stuff, or also if the temperature is like within a certain comfort zone, and the artwork. So ambient smells in gallery spaces are often related to construction and kind of like cleaning products or materials. So he's kind of raising a couple of questions here. First, whether that kind of like concentrated gallery air might affect or even harm visitors, right, who are smelling it, but also how those harmful effects would be magnified for workers like maintenance staff or security guards or construction workers who have more prolonged or intimate exposure to the gallery's air. All right, so the next topic, I'll start with the topic of kind of how scent extraction, right, and scent commodities have historically been made possible by colonialism and race, and were actually like a huge motivation for early kind of like explorers, right? There are bioprospectors, many of them. So the Taiwanese American artist Beatrice Glow exhibited Aromerica Parfumeur in Santiago, Chile, in a gallery that's in a shopping mall. And she kind of gave the exhibit the form of a perfume gallery, right? So it looked like a perfume boutique, but she kind of used that to kind of confront visitors with these racial and colonial histories of plants used in fragrance commodities. So there's a lot going on in the installation, but I'm going to focus on her exhibition of bottled perfumes, which visitors could open up and smell. The perfume bottles were beautifully displayed on light boxes to appeal to visitors' curiosity and to get them to kind of approach and smell and learn about the perfumes. But they were accompanied by posters that drew attention to the colonial regimes of extraction that enabled the production of commodified fragrance. So the posters confronted visitors with the spatially vast and historically deep origins of everyday olfactory pleasures and intimacies, the violent histories that have made available the odorants and spices we regularly take into our bodies. While sampling perfumes that feature scents like cloves, nutmeg, peppercorns, tobacco, sugar, cinnamon, and cacao, visitors learn about the conditions of colonial violence and racialized labor that have made these plants available for consumption. For example, the poster accompanying El Picante, a fragrance featuring nutmeg and clove, notes that, quote, nutmegs only grew in the Maluku Islands until the Portuguese broke the monopoly of the Arabs and Chinese, and recounts that nutmeg motivated the Netherlands to trade the island of Manhattan with England in exchange for the Indonesian island of Run, in a transaction that presumed the dispossession of the Lenape and Bandanese people. Other posters note how black peppercorns motivated British imperial depredations in India, how sugar and guano, which were both referred to as white gold, were produced through racialized unfree labor in Caribbean plantations and on Peru's Guano Islands, where they were worked by Chinese coolies, for example. While most of the scents in the perfumes were pleasant, Glow notes that several of them were kind of like really harsh and not toned down, and visitors kind of got this cloying effect from smelling them. So hang on, I'm not able to access my notes, but basically this kind of like overpowering effect of some of the perfumes, again, interrupts the possibility of like olfactory enjoyment or easy consumption, right? So it makes you kind of like not be able to take it in comfortably And in that way, I think it synergizes really well with the information, historical information on the posters. All right, trying to advance slide. All right, I have a button. Nope. Aha. Okay, so the next topic is olfactory racism, so smell used as a kind of pretext for racism. I'll just start with this quote. Growing up in a Korean-American household, I was immersed in pungent kitchen aromas. The smell of fermenting kimchi and doenjang seemed to sink into our furniture, clothing, and hair. As a child, I often felt ashamed of my family's olfactory world. I wanted to smell American, which I imagined would involve becoming perfectly odorless. But shame works in mysterious ways. The strongest odors disgusted, but also excited me. So this quote is by Anicka Yi, who in 2017 installed Life is Cheap. That's the title of an exhibition at the Guggenheim, New York. So this was at the time, and possibly still is, the most kind of high-profile work of olfactory art around, right? I mean, this, hugely elite international institution, the Guggenheim, and she just is like right out there with smell, as we'll see in a second. Life is Cheap responds to longstanding racial discourses associating Asian immigrants with bad smells and poison air that go back to 19th century public health ideas, and that, of course, we've seen recently in anti-Asian attacks during the COVID pandemic. And it does this by forcing an encounter with, quote, Asian smells. So the installation's first piece, located in the entryway, presented 3 gas canisters, releasing the blended scents of Asian American women, which were sampled from Manhattan's Chinatown and Koreatown. And so those scents blended with the scent of carpenter ants. In what looks like a kind of detention facility, and in a move that completely violates the decorum of museum climate control, Yi immediately gasses the exhibition's visitors. She synthesized the scent released from the canisters in collaboration with the perfumer and a forensic scientist. And she describes the Asian American part of the fragrance as, quote, vegetal and floral with notes of cedar, hay, cumin, and cellophane, and the ant fragrance as, quote, citrusy and meaty. The overall scent, she says, was sweaty and herbaceous until the garlicky note of the ant kicks in. People have described it as delicate, but they also seem unsure of how to talk about it, end quote. So visitors were exposed to this unsettling trans-species and, for many of them, cross-racial scent, as well as its physiological, cognitive, and emotional effects prior to encountering the other 2 pieces in Yi's exhibition. As the wall text notes here, Yi posits the scent as a drug that manipulates perception, offering humans the potential to experience the installation with a new hybridized perspective. The title of this work, Immigrant Caucus, situates the olfactory in explicitly political terms as a kind of caucusing that involves pheromonal inhalations instead of words. So visitors next encountered a diorama titled Force Majeure, which featured agar-coated tiles, framed artificial flowers, and illuminated sculptures overgrown with colorful bacterial cultures, also sampled from Manhattan's Chinatown and Koreatown neighborhoods. Here, visitors visually encountered bacterial scents connected with what they've just smelled. The title of this piece refers to the force majeure clause found in most contracts that releases both parties from their contractual obligations when an extraordinary circumstance prevents fulfillment of the contract, right? So sort of like an act of God. This idea suggests that the intoxicating influence of bacteria and chemical smells could shake up the idea of contract that forms the basis of liberal society. If we're physically, mentally, and affectively transformed by microbes and chemicals, then the air around us has to be factored into our decisions and commitments. Already transformed and perhaps intoxicated by the odor of immigrant caucus, visitors have to give up any claim to occupy the status of Kant's ideal, deodorized, disinterested, and fully rational subject. Yi's work instills olfactory empathy by materially enacting a process of transcorporeal becoming that crosses racial boundaries as bodies and minds chemically inhabit and transform each other through scent. So the third topic is efforts to materially redress olfactory racism and colonialism. So just for a little bit more context for this, environmental justice scholars and activists have long noted that capitalism exposes Black and other racialized communities to disproportionate environmental risks. Recently, scholars have framed environmental racism explicitly in atmospheric terms, as what Christina Sharp calls the weather of anti-Blackness, for example, or as a climate in which Black people, quote, can't breathe, to cite Eric Garner's repeated last words taken up by Black Lives Matter. Sorry, in that case, it's not scholars, it's activists. But even when surrounded by racist atmospheres like those of the slave ship, factory, toxic neighborhood, tenement, or prison cell, Christina Sharp emphasizes that Black people have also produced powerful microclimates supportive of Black breath and life. So I want to turn to a couple of examples of olfactory art and practice that I think really speak to this idea of microclimates that sustain or heal people in the context of environmental violence. So one example I think that's excluded from how we usually think about olfactory art is conjure or hoodoo, right, which involved a lot of aromatic materials, scented products, including perfumes, incense, powder sachets, candles, fumigants, room cleaners, roots, and oils, circulated through mail order catalogs and spiritual supply stores beginning in the 1920s and 30s as a way to reconnect people who relocated during the Great Migration to southern roots. Conjure was often dismissed as superstition, but its olfactory elements promised recent Black migrants to the cities some degree of control over the disproportionately polluted, poorly ventilated atmospheres that they inhabited and inhaled. These products connected the atmospheres of urban homes with syncretic traditions that span Black diasporic geographies throughout the Atlantic world. For example, Van oil, pictured here, which was a popular blend of lemongrass oil and alcohol, features the scent of a grass native to Africa and cultivated in regions like Louisiana. Used for luck and power, its fragrance also evoked a sense of place and diasporic longings, far removed from the city's noxious and deodorized spaces. I'd suggest that these olfactory connections with African, Caribbean, and Southern spaces could have important implications for physical and mental health. So the Washington, D.C.-based artist Renée Stout explores these connections between material atmospheres, spirituality, and health in her hoodoo-inspired artworks. Her exhibition, Tales of the Conjure Woman from 2013, brings together a mysterious multisensory array of works held together by the persona of Fatima Mayfield, who's based on a purveyor of roots, or of healing herbs and potions. Stout's work often alludes to the material and spiritual importance of scent in hoodoo practices. One etching lists the seductive capacities of different perfume brands. Another piece, the Root Workers Table, which is pictured here, includes a list on the chalkboard of, quote, things I'll need for the seduction of sterling Rochambeau. Adam and Eve roots, buckeye, five-finger grass, ginseng, ginger, lady slipper, orchid, orris root, saffron, vanilla, vetiver, patchouli, and Shalimar perfume. Several other works include scented powders and perfume bottles that visitors could uncork and smell. Stout flips the patriarchal script of seduction, deploying the redolent materials of hoodoo to enhance the erotic agency of Black women, or at least her character, Fatima Mayfield, does. Scented materials enable Stout to materialize the atmosphere of conjure, making her installation not just a representation, but an immersive performance. She explains that, quote, my creative process often becomes a literal ritual with candle and incense burning and the gathering of special herbs to insert into the work in an effort to promote healing and evoke the protective energies of ancestral spirits. So my last example is the Mala Podcast and Perfume Project. Mala means bad woman. And sorry, it's by the Bangladeshi American writer and perfumer Tanaïs. Okay, sorry, I lost my place there. Okay, so Mala she holds place for 5 formerly incarcerated women to, quote, retell their stories of survival and reimagine them as scents. So that's kind of the lineaments of the project. Drawing on these interviews, Tanaïs, who, sorry, goes by they, them, creates perfumes intended to support the memories and well-being of Black women whose sensory experience has been deprived by years spent in alternatively deodorized and noxious carceral spaces. One of their subjects, Sharon, describes her release from incarceration in sensory terms. And I'm going to see if I can get this to scroll down so I can read it. Quote, "Do you want to know what it smelled like the day that I left prison? Freedom. I smelt the air. I felt seawater. I smelled all the things that were happy for me when I was a child. The crystalness of the sun and the water. I smelled curry. I smelled, like I was out the door." Bringing these impressions together, Tanaïs created a perfume for Sharon that blends, quote, blood cedar, seaweed, turmeric, pimento berry, allspice, and amber and ocean. So like the fragrant materials of hoodoo, these scents have, sorry, I'm just having a little bit of trouble again, but I'm almost done, so don't worry. These scents evoke connections across a range of place-based memories and life worlds. They integrate scent-inspired memories from different moments in Sharon's life. Here, perfume isn't an escape from reality or a prestige commodity. It reintegrates Black women's memories and heritage that have been eroded by the prison's interruptions of time, place, community, and sensory experience. So, concluding. All right, so just to kind of summarize the main points I've made, olfactory art, I think, offers a kind of powerful critical perspective on the uneven risks associated with deodorization and air pollution, and also on various forms of olfactory racism and colonialism. Olfactory practices of intimacy and anti-racist care, are another topic, and that they kind of have this capacity to create microclimates supportive of BIPOC lives, Black, Indigenous, and people of color lives. So I want to just end with a question, which is how we can connect olfactory work in the spaces of the art world, the museum, for example, with these broader practices of air conditioning from below, right? So conditioning the air that one inhabits, like in everyday terms, through, for example, the conjure examples that I was looking at. So these kinds of practices that intervene in actual lived atmospheres. So how do we bridge that gap? And that's the end of the talk. Thanks.
Thank you for being here. I did in London a few years ago. At one of the Saatchi galleries, they had the whole first floor was petroleum.
Oh wow!
And while it was extraordinary because of it was just the white cube with probably 100 feet long, but it was without odor. And that seems almost impossible. And I'm just curious if how that would make sense unless they had some kind of turbines moving through it, because petroleum at the gas station at least is quite strong.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know if they treated it in that case or did. I don't know. Did they have turbines? I don't know this work, but I think you're raising a really interesting question, right? Which is about the distinction between representation, right? So a representation of petroleum, or just kind of a purely visual relationship to the petroleum, right? Where maybe it was kind of, I mean, I can imagine if you had like glass or plexiglass covering it, versus, sorry?
They didn't, it was
Okay.
just there.
Yeah, versus one where you're inhaling it, which I imagine, I'm a little sensitive to smells. That's another reason that I probably got interested in this. So I don't think I would have wanted to be in front of like petroleum that did smell for more than, a couple of seconds or a minute. And I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, we were, visiting the Saatchi Gallery. We weren't sure what we were going to see, and we thought it was solid.
Mhm.
And of course,
Yeah,
it wasn't.
there is an artwork, I think I have it in a footnote in my book, or in one of my articles, that does include real petroleum with the smell of petroleum. And I'm forgetting the title, but it's out there, so it has been done. And I mean, I do think if you're interested in representing like environmental violence, toxicity, and the kind of disgusting qualities of petroleum, which we completely depend on in all kinds of ways, right? That smell could be a really powerful way to do that, for sure.
Anybody
Thank
else?
you.
With my mask,
We're all now back to this.
okay. So I'm understanding this hierarchy almost of smells, and that civilization, through so-called civilization, we create this hierarchy of smells. I feel like we've also created a hierarchy of species, so that the other thing that we really react to is the smell of animals and I think our erasing our own smells is trying to pretend that we are not an animal. Anyway, and it made me think about that.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, and I think that hierarchy of the senses that I talked about earlier, I mean, scholars have really shown how that maps onto racial hierarchies, gender hierarchies, hierarchies of sexuality, right? So this idea, like homosexuals were supposed to be more kind of like obsessed with smell, women were supposed to be more affected by smell or more susceptible to smell, people of color, and so forth. Although I think that I would say that like race is a bit complicated, because Asian people were stereotyped as being not susceptible to smell, right? That they're willing to live in any kinds of smells, and that's part of like this kind of olfactory racialization. Whereas other racial groups are seen as really susceptible to smell, but also really smelly, right? That they gave off certain kinds of smells. So it gets pretty complicated, but I think you're right that that also maps onto the idea of kind of like rational human, right? This kind of hierarchy that moves down towards the kind of more animal-like kinds of existence, right? Although I'd also add that smell, I think I mentioned this earlier with like microbiomes, right? That smell can connect us really powerfully with non-humans, not just because we smell and a lot of other, non-human animals smell things, but also because we take in smells that are co-produced by humans and bacteria, right? Or there's this really fantastic book by the Potawatomi plant scientist, Robin Wall Kimmerer, called Braiding Sweetgrass. I don't know if anyone's come across it, but I highly recommend it. And she writes about the significance of sweetgrass and sweetgrass harvesting, right, for Potawatomi and some other indigenous people. And she thinks of it as like the symbiotic relationship that evolved, right? She's a scientist, where humans and sweetgrass kind of co-evolved, so that the smell of sweetgrass called people to harvest it. And sweetgrass has this kind of distinctive sort of situation where harvesting it in a kind of responsible way actually strengthens it, right? So the sweetgrass comes away stronger, the humans come out with like, this calming scent that's used for spiritual purposes, but also basket weaving, and has all these different kinds of benefits. So I think that's a really powerful example of kind of human-plant communication, right? That smell really is like, it's a medium, and it's a communicative medium that is not limited to humans or even to animals. And that's, I think, fascinating. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any? Because I had a couple of questions I wanted, well, I don't know if they're really, I wondered in the course of the research that you did for your book, if you looked into the legal dimension or aspect of the control of smells, and that might actually account for the hesitation on the part of art museums in terms of works of art that actually are based on noxious smells or chemically corrosive smells or anything that's perceived as legally culpable, you know. So that I would imagine is probably a big part. I mean, it occurred to me when we did have the Valeska Suarez exhibition that people might actually complain because, you know, I mean, some of the smells that she introduced were headache-inducing, and, you know, certain people do have sensitivities and could potentially sue the museum for exposing them to, you know, whatever, what have you. So, you know, I wondered about the legal dimension of it. But yeah, and then also I wondered if you had thoughts about the relationship, you talked about the opposition in some ways between the visual work of art and an olfactory-based work of art. But what about the relationship between the olfactory and words, too? Because it seems like the only way in which to collect scents is to describe them. And so that the only way to communicate or repeat the experience of the smell is to evoke it through description, as you've just done, and through language. So.
Yeah, great questions. And so I did look into like the legal, you know, like kinds of situation around exhibiting scents. I didn't get very far, and I think that, I mean, basically there's a lot of, as you pointed out, like potential liability issues. Right? And this is part of why in the US, where those laws are much stronger, or stricter, let's say, the olfactory art does not get exhibited much. And I'd be really curious to kind of learn from the Guggenheim what the circumstances were behind Anicka Yi's show. I know she collaborates with pretty fancy scientists, right? So I think that partly, you know, she could kind of document the non-toxicity. But there's also legal situations around like chemical sensitivity, right, where the law does not recognize the kinds of harm that are done, you know, or it's very difficult to get the law to recognize harm done by, you know, sick building syndrome, for example, or different kinds of chemicals in synthetic, you know, products, right, where fragrance is listed as fragrance because it's considered a trade secret, so you just don't know what chemicals are under there. And the corporations don't really, you know, test the potential harm caused by a lot of these substances. So yeah, I think, I mean, another part of the answer would be that a lot of the time olfactory art gets exhibited either through, like I think I showed that Peter De Cupere piece where there's the kind of, he tried to design this so that, you know, it's kind of a little bit more voluntary, right? Like you go up to it and smell it. Although he told me it still ended up having to be exhibited outdoors. So either outdoors and or through these kinds of like relatively enclosed, individualized delivery devices. Yeah, and then on the question of words, I mean, yeah, like my book is half about art, half about literature. So I'm really interested in, you know, how smell gets conveyed through words and through, I mean, we could say representation, whether linguistic or otherwise, right? So, like if you have pictures of olfactory substances, those probably have a kind of resonance with smell, even though you might not be directly smelling something, right? Or seeing petroleum, right? It might kind of invoke or evoke the smell of petroleum, even if you weren't immersed in that smell. So yeah, I think that the question of words versus, like representation versus presentation is really just like really complicated. Yeah. In terms of words, I mean, I do think that literature I have found to be really useful for thinking about well, how do smells get discursively coded, right? So like thinking about representations of, for example, Chinese smells as like sickly or miasmatic, or like this idea of yellow smells that make people sick. You can really see there, like pretty explicitly, how the words are doing this kind of like racial coding. Whereas I think if you directly expose people to the smells, you got different kinds of possibilities, right? And I think I've become more interested in, like, I wrote the book about the smell of risk, but I've become more interested in smells that have like more almost like utopian kinds of dimensions to them, right? So the Anicka Yi one with like the humans and the ants and the like Asian smells, and this idea that it might kind of create a different mindset for perceiving the exhibition, right? And for perceiving each other and for doing politics. Or the last examples that I showed, where like Tanaïs is making smells to support the formerly incarcerated women. She did sell these perfumes. I don't know, how many people bought them, but they were available online. She has an online Botanica, but they've since been removed. So yeah, I think that they were more, you got the sense that they're more for those specific subjects as part of this podcast project and not meant for kind of display, right? So yeah, I think I've been getting more interested in the ways that smells might move us towards something better, rather than just communicating all of the horrible stuff.
Well, I guess that's probably all we should ask of you, but thank you so much for your presentation. It was really fascinating. And thank you all for coming. I hope you come to our next lecture, which will be Charles Palermo, a totally different topic. He's going to be addressing the late sculpture of Juan Miro. We'll be doing an exhibition in the future to do a graphic presentation on Rodin and Miro. So hope I can see you then. We'll publish the whole program for the rest of the calendar year. We just finished, Catherine and I, figuring that out. So you should find that online very soon. But thank you again for coming, and have a lovely evening.